We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
This is Lloyd Bailey, host of the Armed Lutheran Radio podcast. It is truly meet, right, and salutary that you're listening to Warzone Radio with Brandon War.
Let's move on to the biblical themes. Okay. And shockingly enough, there's not as much as I thought there'd be. Now, why did I think there'd be a lot of biblical themes? Well, David Ayer has in the past claimed himself to be a Protestant evangelical Christian. Okay? And he has biblical themes littered throughout his other movies. Fury especially is one that comes to mind more recently. And in the film, there are references to Scripture, mainly from Will Smith's character, Deadshot. He has a lot of the Scripture references. He talks about the Gospels. He talks about even, the squad towards the end kind of being more like a Bible story. Like they're going to be like a Bible story that people talk about good guy or bad guys doing something good. Interesting observation, by the way, of some of our heroes of the faith. Pretty much all of them are sinners. All of them are bad guys who the Lord did something good with. But here's the thing, and this is going back to what I said about the editing being a little sloppy, and maybe they should not have hired a trailer house to work on the edit of the film, is because these Scripture references that Deadshot has, they seem to come out of nowhere. And they're kind of like, what? Huh? He just referenced Scripture there. And to me, I would like it to be a little bit interwoven, maybe in the themes of the film. Just to reference Scripture out of nowhere is kind of just weird. So maybe if we got a different edit of the film, maybe it would make sense. Maybe it would make more sense there. And I understand, and I think that David Ayer actually did a good job with making Deadshot the human center of the film and actually giving him the majority of the sympathetic story that's in the film. I really do think that if we had a different edit of the film, or if David Ayer had a final cut over the film, we'd probably get more biblical references. We'd probably have more biblical themes. Unfortunately, because of the boardroom executive panic mode mentality that Warner Brothers has demonstrated in every one of their DC universe films, we didn't get the deep biblical references I was hoping for. However, we did get a concept that, interestingly enough, can have us discussing a very important doctrine in Scripture. And really, they talk about this, and I want to say there's probably more of this in the original edit of this film as well. But there's really a theme and a concept in the film on what does it mean to truly be evil? What does it mean to be a bad guy versus a good guy? What's the difference? What's the real difference between the Suicide Squad and the Justice League? And it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question that philosophers and many different brilliant minds over the centuries have pondered. In fact, you look at even the lore of the comic books, the DC comic books, and in particular, someone like the Joker, who is a nihilist, who does not believe in anything, who believes in chaos, and believes that everything is relative, who believes that everyone is just one bad day away from being just as evil as he is. That everyone has the pretense for it, for chaos, and not order, not civility. Batman tends to challenge this, of course, hence why Batman and the Joker tend to be the yin and yang of one another. But it's an interesting question. What does it mean to be evil? What does it mean to be good versus bad? Well, let's go to Scripture. I mean, we can ask basic questions, and Scripture seems to have the answers to these. Like the question, is man basically good or basically evil? Well, Ecclesiastes 7:29 says, "See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." Oh, that's interesting. What about Romans 5, verses 7 and 8? "For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows his love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Now, what is the definition of sinner? Well, someone who at their root has sin, has evil. I mean, sin is evil. So are all people like that? Are there any exceptions to it? Well, Romans 3:23, obviously, a lot of people know this verse. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Most people don't really look at this verse, though I like to look at it. Romans 11:32, "For God has consigned all to disobedience." All, okay? And this is interesting. Interesting turn in the verse. That there's a reason that all are consigned to disobedience, that God may have mercy on all. But we're told that people are good. People are good deep down. No. In fact, Jesus says in Mark 7, "From within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within, and they defile a person." That's Jesus' own words. Jeremiah 17:9, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can understand it?" In Titus 1:15, "To the defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but both their minds and their consciences are defiled." Our will is bound to sin. Jesus says in John 8, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin." Our affections and desires have been perverted by sin. You can just read Romans 1 to acknowledge that. So then the question comes, if this is the doomed state of humanity, can we change ourselves? Or can we be righteous in the true sense of the word righteous? And unfortunately, no, we can't do that on our own. God himself says in Genesis 6 and in Genesis 8, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." Only evil from youth. In other words, from infancy. Okay. Unfortunately, Jesus also proclaims in John 6 that no one can come to him unless the Father draws him. So it's it's a question that the film talks about, and especially in the scene right before the ending, right before the end battle, and the character of El Diablo is talking about all those guys. They're just wannabe villains. He's the real villain because of this tragic accident that happened. I'm not going to get into spoilers, but he has a tragic story, and he talks about he blames himself and his actions and his choices and what he chose to do. And they have a discussion on what makes them bad, what makes people good, the inside versus actions and things like this. And they kind of touch on it, but again, I wish there would have been more to it in the film. Interesting thing to talk about, especially, You're going to see a movie where villains are kind of the main heroes of the film. And yes, people can, even unbelieving, sinful, depraved people are capable of doing good with their lives. The only problem is they're not capable of doing good in the sense of where God is concerned. What is good and righteous in God's eyes is to be forgiven of sin. Okay? We are not capable of forgiving ourselves of sin, and we're not capable of absolving ourselves of sin. We're not even capable of coming to Christ by our own free will, because our will is bound to sin, according to Scripture. So, unfortunately, you have a lost cause when it comes to someone trying to simply be good, right? However, there is hope especially for the believer, because Christ is our righteousness. Christ is our goodness. Christ is everything that we are not, put on the cross so that to die for everything that we are, and then to give us himself as a covering, as a peace offering between us and God. And it's an interesting way of looking at the film. It's an interesting way of looking at the film.